Welcome back, everyone, to the Spotlight series. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Reverend John Deere. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
My pleasure, Ahad.
So, Father John Deere is a Catholic priest, activist for nonviolence, and a prolific author, having written 35 books. He has worked with multiple nonviolent organizations such as Bene and his Campaign Nonviolence, which he co-founded. He's been arrested and jailed over 80 times for civil disobedience, showing his dedication to actively furthering the cause of nonviolence. John's latest work is the Beatitudes Center for the Nonviolent Jesus, where he furthers the message of nonviolence by emphasizing Christianity's teachings of nonviolence, especially through Jesus. And that leads me to my first question. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work at the Beatitudes Center?
Sure. Well, thank you. Yeah, I just started it when the pandemic hit. It's beatitudescenter.org. And because we're all under lockdown, I just started doing Zooms like this full time. I'm trying to teach Christians to be nonviolent, Ahad. So wish me luck. For years, I was the director of, it was the largest interfaith peace group in the world. It's the Fellowship of Reconciliation in the 1990s. And Gandhi was part of it. Dr. King was part of it. And I learned um, from meeting thousands of faith-based activists. This is really important, and I hope you remember it, is that nonviolence is at the heart of every major religion. I'm convinced of this now. So, for example, Judaism has a spectacular vision of shalom, right? That the prophet Isaiah said someday people will beat their swords into plowshares and never study war again. And Islam, doesn't that mean peace? And one of my heroes is Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was Gandhi's friend. I hope you've studied him. He's one of the greatest people of nonviolence in history. And he says he was nonviolent because of the Quran and because of Islam. Buddhism, I mean, those people are just showing off. It's so totally nonviolent. I was friends with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he's talking about living so peacefully that you only breathe in peace and breathe out peace. And Gandhi exemplified Hinduism as total nonviolence. But I've been proposing, as Gandhi said, that Christianity is about total nonviolence. Gandhi said Jesus was the greatest person of nonviolence in the history of the world, and the only people who don't know that Jesus is nonviolent are Christians. And it's true, Christians are to blame for so many things, for so many wars and building nuclear weapons. So this has been a lot of my life's work, Ahad. I'm 62 now, and for 40 years, I've been trying to teach people that Jesus is nonviolent. If you want to claim to be a follower of Jesus, you have to practice total nonviolence. And I've done that in many, many different ways throughout my life, from all this work and organizing to writing my books and giving, thousands of lectures and retreats, I don't know, to many, many people around the country and around the world. And working now with Pope Francis to get the Vatican to teach the nonviolence of Jesus. I'm pretty hopeful there. But anyway, I started this um, online project, beatitudescenter.org, to do Zooms about Jesus. And if you look there, the mission is to teach the nonviolence of Jesus and to help Christians and Christian churches reclaim the nonviolence of Jesus and begin more and more to become nonviolent. So my goal is every church, every Christian should be totally nonviolent. Why? Well, all of Jesus's teachings are nonviolence. Love one another, love your neighbor, love even your enemies. And then you can be as loving and nonviolent as God, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, because God lets the sun rise on the good and the bad and the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. In the Sermon on the Mount, which Gandhi thought were the greatest teachings of nonviolence in history, and Gandhi read it, it's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Every day, Gandhi read from the Sermon on the Mount for over 40 years, which is astonishing. You see these spectacular teachings of nonviolence. Blessed are the peacemakers, they are sons and daughters of God, because God is a God of peace and a peacemaker. No, people think God is a war maker and God blesses war. And we have a spirituality of war and violence, as if God is blessing the United States to bomb Iraq and Afghanistan. That's totally baloney. That's idolatry and heresy. Has nothing to do with the nonviolence of Jesus. The key teaching is, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, but I say to you, in the Greek, it says, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. And Tolstoy spent the last 25 years of his life, it's amazing, writing about that one sentence. Did you know that, Ahad? No. And he was considered the greatest writer in the world at the time. And he was trying to convert the Russian Orthodox Church, which was aligned with the Tsar and killing, to the nonviolence of the Sermon on the Mount. And he totally failed. But there was this young guy around the world named Mohandas Gandhi who listened to Tolstoy and converted to nonviolence because of Tolstoy. And then Gandhi converted Dr. King and all the rest of us. It's amazing. So that's a very important statement. Offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. That's what Jesus said. And the climax of the Sermon on the Mount is seek first God's kingdom and everything will be provided for you. And Gandhi said the kingdom of God is total nonviolence. So then Jesus organizes a grassroots movement of nonviolence. It's very clear in the Gospel of Luke. And they march to Jerusalem. This is 2,000 years ago, like Dr. King marching from, Selma to Montgomery, or Gandhi on the Salt March. And there Jesus confronts the empire and the religious establishment, which was oppressing all the people in the name of God. And he does civil disobedience. Jesus, nonviolent civil disobedience in the temple. He turns over the tables. Well, if you do that, you're going to be arrested and tortured and killed. And that's what's happened to him. And Jesus went to his death, Gandhi says, in total nonviolence. The story goes, God raised him from the dead. Jesus came back and is still nonviolent and says, okay, all of you followers of mine, now you go into the world of violence and practice total nonviolence. And some people have done it through history, like St. Francis of Assisi and Martin Luther King and Dorothy Day. But Christianity got co-opted by the empire, the Roman Empire, and now it's part of the American Empire, and it's lost all its nonviolence. Some of us are trying to bring it back, and that's what I'm trying to do at the Beatitudes Center.
Well, that's great to hear, and it's definitely very important work, and it's great that you're doing it.
Thank you.
One thing that interested me actually was you talked about Tolstoy and his work around that one line. Do you know exactly what he was talking about with that line? Was it mostly kind of like activist work of sorts where he was trying to communicate with people about it, or because that's actually very
Um,
interesting to me. I didn't know about that.
yeah. Well, so there's really two questions then. What did Tolstoy mean? And that means, and maybe I ought to talk first by the real question, Ahad, what is nonviolence? And then I'll look at what Tolstoy did. Um, is that okay?
Yep, that's great.
For you and for everybody who's listening, we're going to be talking about this for the rest of our lives. And when you talk about it, we have these mythic figures, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Dorothy Day, Abdul Ghaffar Khan. I mean, they're just incredible. And all they talk about is nonviolence, but we have to figure out what does that mean? How do we define nonviolence? How do you define nonviolence, Ahad? And how are you going to be defining it when you live your long life and when you're 80? See, the thing was, they don't use the word peace because everybody's for peace. Hitler was all for peace. George W. Bush was all for peace, and he bombed and killed everybody in Iraq. Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize and gave a great speech, all for war. It's baloney. And we don't use the word love because the word love has lost its meaning. I love my car. You know what I mean? But nobody uses this word from Gandhi and Dr. King, nonviolence. And so I mean, you could say it means no harming or killing any human being, myself, any creature or other, in thought, word, or deed. No violence in thought, word, or deed. It means active love, pursuing the truth of our common unity, that we are one with every human being on the planet. We're all sisters and brothers. No, we're one with all the creatures and Mother Earth. It means we're actually already reconciled. And the deeper you go into the spiritual truth of reality of our oneness with all humanity and creation and the God of peace, you can never hurt anybody, much less kill somebody, or much less sit back and be passive while there are 30 wars going on and 13,000 nuclear weapons, and we're digging up fossil fuels and leading into catastrophic climate change, or 4 billion people are starving and suffering in extreme poverty, and all this systemic racism and injustice. So nonviolence is not passive, it's active love pursuing the truth of justice and peace. It persistently reconciles with every human being on the planet, and it allows God to disarm our hearts of the violence within us, because we're all addicted to violence. And we're all stuck in like this global epidemic of violence. And then we're supposed to become instruments of God's disarming love, which means from now on, you and I, Ahad, practice unconditional, all encompassing, all inclusive, non retaliatory, universal love for every human being on the planet. And we accept the social, economic, political, and racial consequences and implications of universal nonviolent love. So beautiful. But there's one catch, and this is where we all get into trouble. There is no cause, however noble, however noble. I'm going to say it again. There is no cause, however noble, no matter what they tell us, for which you or I will ever again support the taking of a single human life. So we give our lives to stop the killings. We say it's not right to kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong. We don't kill people, and we work to stop the killings. And we are willing even to give our lives to stop the world of violence and killing, as Gandhi and Dr. King did. So nonviolence is no longer just a tactic or a strategy. It's now an entirely new way of life. It's a spirituality. It's a universal ethic. And it's also a political methodology for social change that always works when it's engaged. Positive social change only happens through bottom-up people power grassroots movements. You can look from the abolitionists to the suffragists to Dr. King's civil rights movement to the anti-Vietnam War movement to all the 100 movements now in the last 50 years, like the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of apartheid and Mandela becoming president in South Africa, or the people power movement to get Marcos to leave the Philippines, and on and on. This is how change happens for the better. So we're talking about change, not using nonviolent means for a nonviolent end. War never brings peace. Peace is the only way to peace. So you're asking about Tolstoy. This is where, so as you see, Ahad, I'm a fanatic of nonviolence. I mean, I live and breathe it since I was a college kid at Duke. I've been studying nonviolence, and I've been talking about it morning, noon, and night every day of my whole life, which means, by the way, every day somebody's telling me, but you got to kill somebody. And I'm saying, no, the days of killing are over. And then I say, but and what would Jesus say? And they're all like, well, why do you bring him up? You know? And I'm trying to teach love and peace and nonviolence. And this was my experience with my friends, Desmond Tutu and Thich Nhat Hanh and Daniel Berrigan. You just live this out for the rest of your life. We're trying to be peacemakers. Anyway, I was really interested in the abolitionists, Ahad. I mean, these people are crazy. And I mean, if you really study them, okay, you could look at the British Quakers and how they got rid of slavery in England, right? 250 years ago, they started organizing. They're just a small group of people, and they're Quakers. And they're saying, we're Christians. You do not enslave other human beings. And Britain has the slave trade, and we're going to stop it. And they did without a civil war. So it then influenced people in the United States, and the two mythic leaders would be William Lloyd Garrison. This is my story about Tolstoy. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. You know them, Ahad? You know those names?
Right, I've heard both.
Yeah, incredible people. So William Lloyd Garrison, like in 1820, starts a newspaper, and he calls it The Liberator, and he has this big speech, maybe in Rochester, New York, and 1,000 people come, and he launches the abolitionist movement. And he stands up and he says, tonight, I mean, think about this. Tonight, we are announcing the abolition of slavery. And everybody laughed at him. He said, you can't get rid of slavery. There's always been slavery. There's nothing you can do. It's in the Bible. And he said, no, we're getting rid of slavery. It's over. And all these people started to join the movement. And then there were these amazing figures like Frederick Douglass, a former slave. And they didn't have Gandhi. They did have the Sermon on the Mount, but they used, in the old bad Bible translations, it was called passive resistance. Offer no resistance to someone who does evil. That's why I said in the Greek, the actual commandment in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus said, I mean, Jesus was like Dr. King. He was doing a nonviolence workshop. It says, offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. Well, they thought that meant be passive. And Gandhi and Dr. King showed it was an aggressive nonviolent resistance. But William Lloyd Garrison, they were just making all this up. So they said, we're practicing passive resistance. And then they started to use the word pacifism, which I don't use. Now, that was from the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, and the Quakers. Are you with me? So they're organizing, and they start the Underground Railroad and all of this, and they're friends with everybody. And it's not working, mainly because the white Christians in the South were crazy. They were insane, and they formed the Ku Klux Klan, and they're getting rich off of enslaving Africans and so forth. It's so evil. It leads to the Civil War. And John Brown was one of the best friends of William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And this is where you need to know your U.S. history. I don't know if you've heard of John Brown, but he led a raid in like 1858 on Harper's Ferry, on the U.S. military there, to try to free the slaves through killing people. He renounced their pacifism and the passive resistance. Isn't that interesting? You see what I mean? And it split the abolitionist movement. The Civil War starts, and what do? Well, they all joined the North to go off and kill the people in the South, including Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison. They renounced the nonviolence of Jesus. And I don't want to do that. But not everybody did. So they're still abolitionists, but they're saying, wait a second, if we're supposed to be like Jesus, and think about this, this is 1860, 1861, we don't want to kill the white crazy Southerners and the Ku Klux Klan people. We want to convert them to the nonviolence of Jesus and end slavery, and let's all live in peace. And they weren't able to get that message out. So here's what happened. Then William Lloyd Garrison died and Frederick Douglass died. But William Lloyd Garrison had a lieutenant. Gosh, Ahad, I'm getting way off the track, but I want to tell you a story, and then I'll end about Tolstoy. The one guy underneath William Lloyd Garrison was a fellow named Aidan Below. He's one of the great heroes of nonviolence in history. You probably never heard of him. And he formed a community of nonviolence in 1875 in a place right on the border of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. It's now a museum today, and he's buried there, and your homework is to go and see it someday. I forget the name. It's kind of like Hopedale. Aidan Below. Anyway, he decided to write like a treatise on like the passive resistance of Jesus means actually no to slavery, but no to war. We're working for the end of war. So he wrote 100-page booklet. No, like it was about a 30-page pamphlet. I'm sorry. It was about a 30-page pamphlet about this. And he died. A great, great man of peace. His son published it as a pamphlet and mailed copies around the world to the most famous people in the world. The President of the United States, the King of England, the Tsar in Russia. Who was the most famous person in the world in 1885? Leo Tolstoy. Aidan Below's son mailed this statement on peace and nonviolence to Leo Tolstoy out of the blue, who read it and was totally converted and spent the rest of his life trying to teach Aidan Below's theology of peace and nonviolence. So instead of he had finished War and Peace, he wrote this massive book on nonviolence called The Kingdom of God is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. And the first 50 pages of it are Aidan Below's pamphlet. And it came out, it was all over the world, and everybody thought Tolstoy had gone crazy. And that's what Gandhi read and converted Gandhi to nonviolence. It was actually Aidan Below's writing. Anyway, I'm interested in the lineage of nonviolence, you see, because then Gandhi wrote a letter to Tolstoy, and we know Tolstoy turned to his assistant and said, this young guy, Indian living in South Africa, is going to be the most important person of nonviolence in the world. And Tolstoy died, and Gandhi became the most important person of nonviolence in modern world history. And he named his ashram in South Africa Tolstoy Farm. I went there. I went to India to see where Gandhi lived. Well, that's a long story, but you can read The Kingdom of God is Within You. And remember, this is all before Gandhi, before Dr. King. Tolstoy and Aidan Below were trying to unpack the Sermon on the Mount. What does passive resistance mean? Isn't that all interesting?
Well, it's actually amazing. I didn't know that Gandhi was influenced by Tolstoy.
Oh,
Didn't know
yeah.
there was a
Oh,
connection
you've
there.
got
Yeah.
to read. Go and if people ever say to me, what are the best books to read? I always say, well, go and read a good biography of Gandhi. I like the Life of Mahatma Gandhi by Lewis Fisher, the big 800-page book. Gandhi's grandson, my friend Raj Mohan Gandhi, who's still alive, he's 86, he knew and loved Gandhi. He wrote a massive 1,000-page book. This is the best current biography of Gandhi called, I think it's just called Gandhi, I think, and The Man and the Empire. And then I also recommend Let the Trumpet Sound, The Life of Martin Luther King Jr. by Stephen Oates. It's also a really good book to read. Thanks for listening.
Hey, thanks. And what you also said about John Brown was interesting because the Brown family that Brown is named after, um, there's two brothers, John and Moses Brown. And what happened was that there's another John Brown who's part of that Brown family, who he was actually a very strong proponent of slavery and the slave trade because he made a lot of
Mm.
money off of it in Rhode Island. But his brother, Moses Brown, actually converted to becoming a Quaker and was very strongly against his brother's very active involvement in the slave trade and slavery. So I always thought that
And
was
then
very
they
interesting.
founded Brown University.
I think it's
That's
they
it's out of Moses Brown.
I think it's they donated a lot of money. I think it's just kind of named after the family. I'm not exactly sure.
See, and that's the history of Rhode Island and
Right.
Massachusetts. There were great abolitionists there. William Lloyd Garrison is buried in Boston, and Aidan Below lived about 30 miles from where Brown University is now. In case people are listening, Ahad goes to Brown University. That's why he's talking about Brown.
Right. Um, Something you talked about that was really interesting was the basically between pacifism and active nonviolence, where
Yeah.
you're saying is activism. Could you, I guess, I know you've done a lot of
Yeah, I
activist
can
work yourself.
explain
Could you
that.
describe, yeah, the importance of activism and nonviolence?
Well, so I lecture on peace and nonviolence all around the world. The United States movement. Well, you heard what I just said. It grew out of the abolitionists. And by the way, the abolitionists were run by men. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose husband, Henry, in 1830 was a very famous preacher and leader in the abolitionists. They used to have these great meetings at Seneca Falls, New York, and women were not allowed to attend because they're women. So the suffragettes, the women's movement, became out of the abolitionists. It was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then they kind of got together, and many of them realized what they were doing. All of this led to the foundation in 1915 in Europe of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which were Protestant Germans and Protestant French people killing each other in World War One. And they decided, hey, we're followers of Jesus, we can't kill each other because of the tradition in the Mennonites and the Quakers of pacifism. So they formed a global movement, but it was only for Protestant Christians, called the Fellowship of Reconciliation. It's since changed, and now it's all religions and interfaith. But originally, it was mainly Christians, and then Gandhi became a big part of it, and they did great work. It started in the US around 1920. And by the way, it led to the ACLU, it led to the American Friends Service Community, the American Committee of Jews. I mean, so many groups and projects. The civil rights movement came out of FOR. They always use the word pacifism. Okay. And so into the 1960s and 1970s, they expanded and Catholics became part of it, and the Berrigans and Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton and Dr. King had been part of it, but he was a Protestant Baptist Christian. But he was using Gandhi's words nonviolence. And that's how the change began to happen. When I became the head of FOR in the 90s, but I have never, in all my talks, even 40 years ago, I started speaking out when I was your age, Ahad. I never used the word pacifism. Why? Because everybody thinks it means passivity. And there's nothing passive about nonviolence. In fact, if you're passive, you're part of the problem. That is not active nonviolence. That's not peacemaking. So the world says in the face of violence, you can only do two things. You fight back with violence, you use the means of your opponent, which is violence, or you do nothing, you run away. Well, that's not nonviolence either. Then you're just allowing the violence to continue. From Jesus to Gandhi, we have a third way, which is active, creative nonviolence, where you don't run away. You're not passive. You engage your opponent in active nonviolent love, and you say, "Hey, don't hurt me," and you call them to the truth of our common humanity, even to the point where you're willing to accept suffering without retaliating in pursuit of the truth of justice and our common humanity until the opponent is disarmed through suffering love. This is what Gandhi and King said how it works. I've tried it in one-on-one where I've been threatened and I have disarmed people. This stuff really works. You have to go experiment with it. So that's why and Dr. King spoke of active nonviolence. He said militant nonviolence. If you are not speaking out, if you are not actively resisting the structures of nonviolence, you are complicit in systemic violence. That's a great truth. And my friend Archbishop Desmond Tutu spoke about that all his life. Because if you weren't speaking out against apartheid, you were for it. If you are not speaking out against war, nuclear weapons, racism, police violence, executions, poverty, the 1% controlling the wealth of the country, the digging up of fossil fuels, you are for it. I'm sorry, folks, but your silence is complicity. That's why I say nonviolence, and I'll end with this part. For me, this is, I've been trying to teach it, and I wrote a whole book on this called The Nonviolent Life, which says active nonviolence or active peacemaking requires three simultaneous attributes. You have to be, number one, totally nonviolent to yourself. It's hard because we were raised in violence. We're all violent and we all beat ourselves up. I'm no good. I'm not, and I'm saying, no, we don't do that anymore. You're not violent to yourself. You have to train yourself to be nonviolent to yourself, to make peace with yourself. You want to go really deep, give a space for the God of peace to live inside you. At the same time, you have to practice meticulous nonviolence toward every human being on the earth and all the creatures and Mother Earth. So you have to be nonviolent to your parents, your friends, your brothers and sisters, your children, your neighbors, all the other kids in school, everybody in your work, everybody in your town, everybody in the country, everybody in the world. And you practice with nonviolence with the people who you don't like to be with, the difficult people in your life. And then you practice nonviolence to people who threaten you. And you become fearless and courageous, and you try to disarm them. And to the creatures, you have to become a vegetarian, and to Mother Earth. But at the same time, there's a third attribute, and this is where it gets beyond pacifism. You have to have one foot involved in the global grassroots movements for justice, disarmament, and creation. You have to be involved in the movement. And by that, I mean, pick a cause and get involved for the rest of your life. I like to think of tithing my time, like so many hours of my week for the rest of my life, Ahad. I'm going to be doing something for justice and discernment. So if you're passionate about fighting racism or ending homelessness, great. Or you want to work to end war and nuclear weapons, great. Or you want to work to protect the environment, great. It sort of doesn't matter because once you've got your foot in the movement, all the causes and the struggles are connected. We have to learn to connect the dots. What we're really up against is an entire system of violence, institutionalized systemic violence, which is going to destroy the planet through nuclear war and catastrophic climate change. So we need to keep building the grassroots movement of nonviolence. So that's why pacifism, the word, doesn't work. And Gandhi and King were right to use this very clumsy word from Hinduism, ahimsa, but we call it active nonviolence, engaged nonviolence, where you're working with people to organize nonviolent movements aimed at systemic violence and to try to disarm them. And I've seen it work. I was part of the Standing Rock campaign, seen us use active nonviolence to end the war in Iraq, to end apartheid. And it works, but you have to organize it, and it's hard work. So I hope that helps some of it, explain some of my thinking.
Oh yeah, that helps a lot. Um, I guess connected to that, could you explain how to best get involved? You think you said to, I guess, pick a cause that's important to you and aim for it, but do you know if any, I guess, best ways to get involved for anybody watching?
Well, that's really the question because nobody cares about nonviolence, and you don't hear anybody talking about it. That's why I'm doing this. I mean, it's really kindergarten level work trying to get the Christian churches to become nonviolent. There's so much work to do, and we're still back at square one. Thou shalt not kill. Or to get all of Islam and Judaism and Hinduism and even Buddhists to be nonviolent. Thich Nhat Hanh complained to me how the Buddhists in Sri Lanka were killing each other. So what happened? So there are not that many groups that teach nonviolence, but if you're interested in this, look them up. Fellowship of Reconciliation, my old group, forusa.org. And within them, they have the religious groups of nonviolence. So they have the Muslim Peace Fellowship, the Jewish Peace Fellowship, the Catholic Peace Fellowship, the Episcopal Peace Fellowship, the Buddhist Peace Fellowship. You can Google all of them and join them. And friends, and especially young people, you have to join them. I remember in 1982, when I realized I had to do this, I joined 15 groups. And that means you send them $50. You pay your membership dues. I mean, otherwise, what the heck are you doing? You have to really be with people. You have to become part of the movement. And it hurts. It means you got to go to meetings. You got to Who wants to go to meetings? And you got to help out, and you got to be humble and say, what can I do to help? Pax Christi is the national U.S. Catholic group. If you're Catholic, they're really good and organized. My friends at Bene do really good nonviolence trainings. And that's what you need to do, is everybody needs to go off on a weekend program which is what Martin Luther King used to do all the time. And they train you in how to live and practice nonviolence. So their website, it's based on something St. Francis used to say, pace e bene, in Italian means peace and all goodness, PACEEBENE.org, pace e bene. And there's other places like the Meta Center, Rhode Island, the University of Rhode Island has the King Center on Nonviolence. The King family runs the King Center of Nonviolence in Atlanta, Georgia. You can look them up. And you basically want to look up any peace and justice groups where you live and just get involved. So, Google your local peace and justice center, peace and justice groups, groups that teach nonviolence, and join them. Go to a meeting, go to a workshop, bring a friend. And what I did, when I was your age, was I decided to be friends with activists who were working for peace and justice and the environment and teaching nonviolence. And I said, those are people I want to spend my life with. And that's what I've done. They all became my friends. And then I got to meet Thich Nhat Hanh and Desmond Tutu and Daniel Berrigan. You meet the best people on the planet because there's not that many people that care. But, so make friends with other activists. I get excited and I start hitting the table. Sorry,
Yeah, that's great to hear. Thanks a lot. Is there, I guess, related to that, and especially with activism and your activism, we talked earlier, or I said before, how you have been like arrested around, you said 80 times, I think was on your bio, but I guess talking about that, do you have a favorite story or like an interesting moment in regards to either one of those incidents um or just in your
sure.
activism in general?
Yeah, yeah. Well, gosh, I hadn't thought of it that way. But so when I was your age, and I said, I was studying Gandhi, and Gandhi professed 16 vows in his 30s, 16. A vow of nonviolence, a vow of poverty, a vow to respect all world religions, a vow to wear only clothes that he himself had made. I think that's showing off Gandhi. A vow of truth, a vow of fearlessness. Isn't that amazing? So I professed a vow of nonviolence, like Gandhi did. And I wrote a book about it. And I was trying to think, well, how do you live? How do you be a peacemaker? How does one spend one's whole life teaching nonviolence like Gandhi and Dr. King? Here in the United States, we have a lot of examples with Dorothy Day and Martin Luther King and Daniel Berrigan, my friend. And there's a lot of peace groups and justice groups and nonviolence groups. There's lots of work to be done. But I realized you had to write books and you had to give talks, and I don't want to give a talk, but I started giving talks and I studied, and you have to study the stuff. So I've studied it. You have to join all these groups. I joined every group I could think of. I still have groups today. You'll have to have a community of friends and peace and justice groups for the rest of your life, because you can't do this on your own. It's just like AA. You need to be part of a group, or, But then I realized that all the great people got arrested, that you had to organize public demonstrations and you had to participate in them regularly. I got to know Cesar Chavez. He was a great teacher of nonviolence and the founder of the United Farm Workers. And once, long ago, before he died, I asked him, what should I tell people if they ever ask, well, what do we do? And he started hitting his fist. He said, John, for the rest of your life, tell everybody, public action, public action, public action. If they want to be people of nonviolence, that they have to engage in some public action for justice, disarmament, and creation. Isn't that fantastic? So you see Martin Luther King leading the Montgomery bus boycott, or he's leading a march from Selma, or he's going into Memphis for the garbage workers strike when he was killed. He's taking public action. He's organizing. Everybody's going to be totally nonviolent, but we're going to stand up and say no to racism. We're going to say no to the Vietnam War. We're going to say no to nuclear weapons and so forth. So I started doing that. And in the 1980s, there were, I went to the Pentagon and got arrested. I went to the White House and got arrested, went to the Congress and got arrested. I've been arrested all those places many, many times. I'm like permanently banned from them. I show up and they want to arrest me. And I've been arrested about 85 times. But my idea was, since 1982, I've always been planning some nonviolent civil disobedience action. I've always engaged in it. And then I've always had to go to court and face jail. And I've been doing this for 40 years now, in and out of court. So my entire life for 40 years is in and out of court. I have about 15 lawyers who help me out. And I've spent about a year of my life in jail. But, I don't even remember them anymore, because for me, I think if you're going to practice nonviolence in the United States, which is the most violent nation, not only in the world, but in the history of the world, just planning the destruction of the planet, you have to be in total nonviolent resistance. So that's why I'm always organizing and preparing actions. So, my most notorious act was in 1993 with Philip Berrigan, when I did a plowshares action. We walked in this big military base in North Carolina called the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, where they have the F-15E. It's a big aircraft. There were 75 of them on the military airstrip that morning. They carry nuclear bombs. They're the planes used to bomb and kill everybody in Iraq and Afghanistan. What do? Jesus said, love your enemies. So I translate that to mean you've got to stop our country from killing their enemies. So we walked onto the base, right through thousands of soldiers. We just walked right on. And because the prophet Isaiah said someday people are going to beat swords into plowshares, we came up to one of these massive airplanes with nuclear bombs on them. And I took out a hammer and I went up and hammered once on the side of the nuclear fighter bomber. Didn't even chip the paint. And we were enacting what the prophet Isaiah said 3,000 years ago. Isn't that great? And I faced 20 years in prison. I was arrested and had a big trial. It was in the New York Times. And I'm convicted of several felony charges: destruction of government property, conspiracy to commit a crime. So the U.S. government, I can never vote again. I'm considered as high up a terrorist as there is in the United States, because I was messing around with nuclear weapons, trying to get rid of them. I can't travel to a lot of countries. I'm not allowed in Canada or Japan, for example. And I'm highly monitored. But to me, so was Gandhi and so was Dr. King, and they were killed. And so was Jesus, by the way. So this is part of my discipleship to the nonviolent Jesus. And how do we get rid of nuclear weapons? To me, you have to engage the law, which legalizes mass murder in our name. The only way you can't put nuclear weapons on trial, but you can if you touch them. We hammered once on it. It was a totally ridiculous symbolic act, but we were telling the world, this is the future. We have to disarm. I did 9 months in a tiny cell, and I never left the cell the whole time. And then I did 2 years under house arrest. But I don't even remember that I've been arrested so many times since then. Just before the pandemic started, I was arrested with my friend Jane Fonda and Reverend William Barber as part of Fire Drill Fridays. It's a great new movement, but the pandemic shut it down. There were 1,000 of us marched on the U.S. Congress to demand that Congress fund climate justice and stop digging up fossil fuels. And we went to the U.S. Senate office building, the Hart building, and 140 of us, including Jane and Dolores Huerta and Gloria Steinem and Reverend Barber, we all sat down and shut the building down in nonviolent civil disobedience. And we were all arrested. And what people don't know, Ahad, is we were let off in chains, and dumped into a warehouse for a whole day. And we were ecstatic. We were so happy. It was front page news around the world the next day because of Jane's fame. But, you know, you don't know what to do, but we have power if we stand up together to say no to our government. And Jane had been organizing weekly civil disobedience every week, and I can't sit back while she's doing all that in DC. I had to go and be part of it. And that's part of, you have to get involved, and no one's going to ask you or invite you, so you have to proactively choose to get involved with nonviolent resistance. But no one told me it was going to be so much fun and that you get to meet so many great people. I think it's a spiritual experience that God was with us as we sat in that day, and you felt consolation and joy. And that's why I encourage people, be really nonviolent, get involved in resistance, and take risks. Just be meticulously nonviolent, and let's, what we need in the end are people who are frontline people in the movement. This is from the abolitionists to the civil rights movement. Good people who break bad laws and accept the consequences. That's what, in the end, civil disobedience is required to really bring down this injustice of systemic racism and warfare and nuclear weapons and environmental destruction. More people need to take risks. And you go to jail and you be nonviolent. You learn, like Gandhi and King did, to transform it into a place of peace and hope and prayer. Isn't that great?
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, that's a really important message, I think, send to people is just the importance of doing, but also that it can be so much fun that you can learn so much along the way.
Yeah, yeah.
Great to hear.
You'll learn a lot more in jail than you will at Brown University. I
Yeah,
learned a lot more from the movement and from the poor than I did from Duke University, where I went.
hey, I mean, that's great to hear. Um, is there, I guess, to wrap up, is there anything else that you want to tell us or any last words of wisdom you want to leave us with?
Wow. Yeah, let me think of a couple of things. Um, well, a big philosophical question is, what does it mean to be a human being? And I think to be human is to be nonviolent. I could say to be loving and to be peaceful, but everybody's loving and peaceful, and we're still building bombs and killing people and in the military. To be human is to be nonviolent, which means we have to get rid of our guns, not join the military, quit the military, be careful how we make money so that we only have jobs that are pro-human and help and serve the human race, but not prepare for war and killing. So we don't build weapons. And if anybody's listening and does that, you quit your jobs. And we help build up the grassroots movement so that we can, because I think we're all becoming inhuman. It's like we're all becoming a world of zombies. The United States is very, very sick, and we have to help each other become nonviolent. I think that's why I say we're addicted to violence, and it is like AA. We need the churches and the religious community should be violence anonymous to help us turn to our higher power and become sober people of nonviolence. We're always violent in our hearts, but we want to try to be as nonviolent as possible from now on. We need to form communities about that, teach each other, train each other, help each other, and then take to the streets. So it our basic humanity is about being nonviolent, but we can't do it on our own. You can't really. I mean, you'll end up just watching the TV and the next war, and you'll be watching CNN and the bombs are falling. You're going, oh, that's too bad. I wish somebody had done something. That's not nonviolence or being a peacemaker. You have to be the one to do something. Every one of us has to be empowered. Martin Luther King defined nonviolence as power. We are not powerless. So get with your friends. I mean, that's what I would do if I were you, Ahad, at Brown. Start a peace and justice group. Bring me in to speak and teach and help and start experimenting with nonviolence right there in Rhode Island. Take to the streets, see what happens. And For the rest of your life, be part of a peace and justice community and talk about nonviolence and study the great books of nonviolence, but always have a group of friends or a community or peace and justice group that supports you on your little, so that you do your little bit for peace and justice the rest of your life. Okay, well, if I'm saying it's like AA, Violence Anonymous, then I do think that we have to turn to our higher power. So let me say, secondly, for the record, that I think the scandal of all the world's religions, but especially Christianity, is that God is totally nonviolent. Gandhi said the kingdom of God is nonviolence. This is really good news. There are no wars in heaven. There's no United States in heaven. It's all inclusive, universal, infinite love and infinite peace and total nonviolence. And God wants that to come to earth. So, what I'm talking about, wherever you are in your religious tradition, apply nonviolence to it and develop a spirituality of nonviolence. Don't worship the false gods of war. Worship the God of peace, a God of nonviolence, a God of universal love, and then try to become a person of peace and person of total nonviolence and a person of universal love. And then try to help to get your religion to talk about nonviolence. That's what I'm doing at the Beatitudes Center.org. And then be a person of meditation. Remember, Gandhi meditated for 1 hour every morning and 1 hour every evening for the last 45 years of his life. And by the way, he was a busy guy, Ahad. I know you're busy at Brown, but he was busier. He was running a revolution. So it's no excuse. Take time. I recommend 30 minutes a day. Start your day with God. Read a little bit of the Christian scriptures, the Muslim scriptures, the Hindu scriptures, like Gandhi did, but get to know the God of peace and let God disarm your heart, and then spend the rest of your day in a spirit of that peace and love everybody, serve everybody, be nonviolent to everybody. The last thing I would say would be about hope. I never understood hope. And I'm kind of a pessimist, I'm sorry to say. Gandhi was an optimist, but I think things are really grim. But hope, I believe in. Hope is, well, I'm going to use a big Greek word. It's eschatological. It takes in God and salvation history, the whole history of the universe and human race. Well, then I'm with Martin Luther King that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In the end, there's hope. But I don't think it's a cheap hope. I think hope is costly. You've got to really engage in what's hopeless: permanent warfare, systemic racism.
Oh, John, can you hear me?
Are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Should I
Did you?
just keep going? I don't know what
Sure.
happened. We
Yeah,
got disconnected.
I think we just, yeah, I don't know what happened. Some issue with the internet connection, I guess.
Yeah, it could be me, by the way. I live in a remote area. I'll just try to sum that up one more time, okay? So hope is not cheap. It's costly. We have to engage in the movements and do our part for the abolition of war and racism and nuclear weapons and poverty and climate change. It's an active thing. Um, and as I said, I never really understood hope But my friend Daniel Berrigan said, if you want to be hopeful, you have to do hopeful things. That's a beautiful teaching, isn't it? You have to engage, and that's why I keep getting arrested and organizing demonstrations. My life is engaged in a positive, hopeful vision for the human race. Dorothy Day said, "You can't avoid. We can't afford the luxury of despair. There's too much work to do." So despair is not about peace and nonviolence. Don't give in to despair, folks. That's why I'm talking about hope. But it was Martin Luther King who helped me the most. Martin Luther King said the week before he was killed, he began to talk about hope for the first time in his life. And he defined hope as this: hope is the final refusal to give up. I think it's a very powerful definition. He's saying we are going to keep being hopeful and working for a new, more just, peaceful, nonviolent world, even no matter how hopeless everything seems. Isn't that great? And so I'll end with a story from my friend Howard Zinn. He was a great historian, and he wrote this massive book, which became a bestseller, A People's History of the United States. Did you ever hear about that, Ahad?
I haven't heard of it, no.
Okay, well, you got to read that book. It's a history of the movements. This guy invented it, studying the history of movements. Isn't that great? And he told me just before he died that all the movements in US history, from the beginning, the middle to the end, were hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. Think about it, the abolitionists, the suffragists. You study the labor movement from the 1930s. These people were amazing. The civil rights movement, they're not going to end segregation. We're still fighting it today, you know. The anti-Vietnam War movement, how are those college kids going to end the Vietnam War? How are you going to bring the Berlin Wall down and end communism and end apartheid? That's ridiculous. And then Howard realized, well, what happened? Because there was a big breakthrough in each one of these movements. And he said, why? And if you go back and study the abolitionists, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, why did the change happen? And he said it's because good people didn't give up. Ordinary people gave their lives doing 1, 2, or 3 things every day for justice, disarmament, creation, even though they knew they weren't going to live to see the victory they wanted. They're going to do it anyway. I'm going to work to end slavery and racism, but I know I'm not going to live to see it. It'll be for the future. I'm going to work for the right for women to vote, even though I will never live to see it. I'm going to do it anyway. And Dr. King is building a movement. We are working for an end to segregation in the South. You're not going to do that. But we're going to do it anyway. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. It's the truthful thing to do. And you end doing a very deep spiritual practice. You do the good because it's good. You do what's right because it's right. And you leave the outcome in God's hands. And Howard Zinn, the historian, said, that's how nonviolence works. All of a sudden, if you have people who are going to keep at this and they don't go away, it becomes contagious. And then it spreads like wildfire. And you end slavery. And women get the right to vote. And you end segregation. And you end the Vietnam War. And apartheid ends. You see what I mean? That's how movements work. But it's the power of nonviolence. And what we need are dedicated people, faithful people, committed people who are going to give their lives, like me and like you, Ahad, for the rest of our lives, working for justice for the poor, for an end to racism, for the end to war, end to nuclear weapons, for disarmament and for creation. And we can trust, we can be hopeful that creative nonviolence will catch fire and become contagious one day, whether or not we live to see it, you know? And people are going to learn the wisdom of nonviolence. So that's my hope and prayer for everybody, that we could all practice nonviolence and follow the God of peace and nonviolence and figure out how to work for a more nonviolent, peaceful world. Thanks for having me, Ahad.
Thank you so much for coming on, John. That was an amazing message. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
If you think these conversations are important and would like to see them continue, please consider supporting NVI and the work we do by subscribing to this YouTube channel, following us on Twitter and Facebook, and visiting our website. Please consider donating to our organization and checking out our nonviolent training archive and database linked in the description. Every little bit counts to help build a more just and nonviolent world.